respect some of the superstitions of others. Often they are founded in fact.
Broadcasting live from our Sanctum Sanctorum in Venice, California. I'm Krista.
I'm Kristen.
And we are the Sixth Sense Society. Welcome to another episode of the Sixth Sense Society. Tonight, we are happy to have Reverend Jim McGrath back tonight. He is the pastor at Gateway Christian Church, and he's been on other episodes of the Sixth Sense Society, so make sure to check it out. We will be talking about the rise of fundamentalism and evangelicalism. That's a difficult word, actually.
Yeah.
So before we start, however, we're going to have Michael give a couple announcements.
Okay. We got lots of cool stuff coming up, but just a couple of things real quick. We did pass 200 subscribers on YouTube, so thanks to everybody for supporting the show. We love that. Please like us and comment, and we would love to hear your comments and any show ideas you might have. We'd be happy to hear. But thank you so much for your support out there. Next week we'll be talking about tarot again, and we're going to look at some of the cards that people we think misinterpret greatly and try and give our own insight to that, especially based on Kabbalah. So any tarot enthusiasts, this is a great show that you want to catch. And then the last Sunday, we will be having Olivier, our new co-host for the Cosmic Weather, and we will be talking about signs and synchronicities. So those are the two shows coming up. And then we're working on some very cool shows for next month already. So stay tuned. Get all the information on our website, which is sixthsensesociety.com, SIXTH, sixthsensesociety.com, and go visit it, and you'll find all the information on us and links back to our own pages and everything else. So I'm not going to keep you guys too long, since I know we want to get into it with Jim, and it's always fun having Jim here. So take it away, guys.
Great. Thanks, Michael. Before we start, I wanted you guys to get to know Jim a little bit more because he does so many cool things. And what I want you to know about is the Imagination Workshop. And I'd like you to share a little bit about what that is and your involvement in it.
Okay, the Imagination Workshop is a arts and mental health nonprofit. And it's I think, the oldest running arts and mental health nonprofit in the country. It's turned 60 this year.
Wow.
We turned 60, and it was founded by an actress named Margaret Ladd, whom you might remember from a show called Falcon Crest.
Oh, yes.
And her husband, a playwright, Lyle Kessler, who is wrote a play called Orphans and is a mentor of mine.
A brilliant show, a brilliant play.
Yeah, and many, many others.
Yes.
Two gifted people. And they... Margaret was attending a play. This is back in the 60s. She was attending a play that was being performed by the inmates at a psychiatric hospital. And she attended the play with the playwright Ionesco. And as they were watching the play had been written and was being performed by the inmates. And Ionesco turned to Margaret and said, they write from the place that dreams come from. Mm. And this somehow for her just triggered something. And she began this program where theater professionals, actors, writers, and directors would go into a locked ward. And they would do, it's a structured activity that Margaret and Lyle created that brings out creativity in them. And there are exercises where they write scripts and they act them. And unlike psychodrama, where the patient is writing about their own life and their own pathology, an imagination workshop, that's verboten. And it's all about making up something just totally out of the blue.
Oh.
You know, it's like you create a character that could be like Buck Rogers. You know, you create a character for yourself that you will eventually embody on the stage.
How healing.
That is yes. And just the great story about that. They were in a locked ward, and they were having this group, and the hospital orderly said, "You don't want this guy. He's comatose. I mean, he hasn't said a word in 10 years." And they said, "Yeah, no, bring him in." And the exercise was that you would pick someone in history that you admire, and you would become them. You would physicalize that person. You don't tell anybody who it is. You physicalize that person, and then you say a nursery rhyme the way that person would say it. And people try to guess who it is. That's the exercise. And this guy suddenly started talking like Louis Armstrong. And he hadn't spoken a word in like 10 years.
Oh, my God.
But he somehow, as Louis Armstrong, he was safe to say things, and that's kind of the science that's behind it. So I started working with them as an artist leader. Back then I was an actor, like around 1984. And I've been with them ever since, and now I'm the executive director. And we've widened the scope of who we work with. It's not psychiatric patients so much as any kind of at-risk population. We do a lot of work with the veterans. We do a lot of work with the homeless, work with seniors who have Alzheimer's, different, at-risk school kids, different communities like that. And we just finished doing a play at New Directions, which is a great organization for homeless veterans. Mm-hmm. And I'm the executive director of it now. It's a small nonprofit, and small nonprofits are very difficult to keep alive in this day and age. Yeah. So if you want to help us out, go to imaginationworkshop.org.
Yes.
We need your help. It's great and wonderful work. The thing that the veterans experience, these are veterans who are trauma victims. And what they say about the group is, in all the groups I'm in all day, I have to relive the trauma. I have to talk about it. I have to be this person who's had this horrible experience, and I'm all messed up. And in our group, you get to not be that.
Get to change the story.
Yeah, you get to change the story. So it's they say, this is the first time I've ever thought about the future. It's you.
Well, it helps them to change the neural netting. It actually, because they can get things stuck in there, and we want to change, but it's actually in our neural netting. But the more we practice a new routine, like they say, how to change a habit in 21 days. Well, it's the more you repeat. So by getting the story in, and then they can take that with them, and they're like thinking about it every single day, and that begins to help, I imagine, to feel better and actually to change things. On the inside, actually, in the brain.
It's empowering.
Yeah.
It's like, you mean I can actually make something up?
Yes.
And just build it like I want it to be?
Right.
Wow. It's like...
Right. And you can be that. You can become that in your real life. Maybe you can't become like a superhero.
That's how whatever you are, that's how it starts.
Yeah.
It starts that way anyway.
Yeah.
It starts with the imagination. Everything does. Even in therapy, I remember reading maybe about 8 years ago that they were looking at the idea that you can look at your trauma too much, that repeating the story over and over, that they were really rethinking how much anyone should be doing that it was actually not helping anymore. So not that you should avoid it completely, but that wasn't happening, constantly going over it, like through talk therapy.
It's the constantly going over it.
The constant.
In Freudian psychology, the idea is that your shadow or your subconscious is sort of the basement where you throw everything that you don't want to look at again. So what you do is you take inventory. Mm-hmm. You take inventory, you see what's there. But it's the repetition that
it's the repetition.
You just have to do it every day.
It'd be like you never finished. It's like that thing in Philip K. Dick's Scanner Darkly, where this guy is standing in front of his bed saying, "I'm now going to read you a list of your sins. The list will go on indefinitely. It will never end." It's like,
yes,
that's very similar. You're right. Yeah. Well, I think it's a fantastic program. I saw the little clip of that one that you posted and the play that they were doing, and I was kind of impressed by it. It looked like they were having a lot of fun, and
well, it really came out well.
Yeah,
it came
really
out great.
did, and I was very touched by it. So thank you for sharing that.
Well, thank you for bringing it up.
Of course. Donate. Head over to that website.
imaginationworkshop.org.
You got it.
Thank you.
So let's jump right into the topic. And my first question is, can you define in your own way what fundamentalism is?
Okay, well, first I'll give you the dictionary definition, and with which I disagree. Basically, fundamentalism, and it specifies in Christianity and Islam. because in Judaism, we can get to that, we're talking about something very different. But in say, Christianity and Islam, and I would throw in Hinduism, it's insisting on a literal interpretation of Scripture. And that's the definition. I would add to that, because I don't believe that that's really what they do. Mm-hmm. That's what they claim. But I would add to that a fundamentalist is someone who insists that religion is about us versus them, rather than being about wholeness and oneness.
Oh, I like that.
In all of the world religions, religion was my major as an undergraduate. Mm-hmm. It's just a bachelor degree. It's not a PhD, but I read a few books. And I feel that in all the religions, there really are only two religions, and those two religions exist within each religion. There's the religion of what I would call emanation, or in other words, the religion in which we come closer and closer to God, or closer and closer to becoming God, or to becoming one with God. And then there is the religion of law, rules, exclusion, partitions, the idea that, there was an old Mel Brooks, Carl Reiner bit, The 2,000-Year-Old Man, where the question is, what's the oldest patriotic song in the world? The first patriotic song. And the 2,000-year-old man answers, everybody can go to hell except cave number 73. And that's, in my opinion, what fundamentalism is. It's an unwillingness to be ecumenical, an unwillingness to admit that there are people not in our cave who might be getting into heaven. Mm-hmm. That's my definition of fundamental exclusivity, and the need for there to be an enemy, an other. That exists, in my opinion, in every fundamentalist movement there is. Certainly what we have today, and I'll get into that in a minute because it's a little different from what fundamentalism started in, but the current evangelical movement, there is this strict insistence upon being moralistic rather than moral. And you see the difference. To be moral, that's about what you do. To be moralistic is about judging what other people do, which fundamentalists, if they have such a literal interpretation of the Bible, how do they miss Jesus' instruction not to judge? How do you miss that? Yeah. It's, if you're going to be literal, again, it's like...
They miss a lot, it seems like.
Well, it's a misnomer. And what really enrages me is the way that the people of what I would call the fundamentalist camp have won the PR war. To where most people in this world, whether they're churchgoers or not, most people think Christianity is about abusing women and, going after gay people. That's what the religion is. That's what the religion's about. Mm-hmm. If I was a young person growing up today, that's what I think, Christianity was about. They have won the propaganda war. So now the idea is, instead of the old hymn where they had the line, they will know we are Christians by our love, it's, I'm a Christian. You announce it. I'm a Christian. And that means you have to watch your language. That means you can't get an abortion. You can't be gay. It's that sense of the other. But I see, and I'm not talking about rank and file people. I think there's a lot of good people who believe this stuff and they live by it. But the leaders of it do not seem to live by it. Mm-hmm. There's no rescibility taken for sexual promiscuity,
especially
and
that.
They do
abuse
everything.
of women. Yeah. In fact, the abuse of women seems to be a common theme. But anyway, I'm way off the whatever.
So let's talk a little bit, because we were talking earlier before the show about when it actually started, because it seems like it's been around forever, but that isn't the case.
Well, in speaking of American religion, and the history of American religion is just a fascinating study, because really this country, one way in which this country is very different is there's no state religion.
Right.
And there's a legal protection of religious freedom.
Right.
So the growth of religion, and it has grown and grown, or at least during the first couple of 100 years it grew and grew. The growth of religion in a setting like that is, I think, a fascinating subject, because it's about people and it's about what they believe and what they think. And in the old days, when religion would come into politics, it would just be a matter of who the people were that were voting. You know, it's if people want to vote a certain way, that the candidate has to be a Christian and claim to have certain values and whatever, or they won't vote for him. You know, I mean, that's how it comes in. It's not the case today, but that was the case most of the time. But really, in the history of American religions, the American church, the mainline Protestant churches, were totally with progressivism, social justice, science, all of these things. The church brought a lot of heat and money to the abolitionist movement. The Methodist women were very much behind getting women the vote. A lot of progressive things. The first part of the 20th century is known as the Progressive Era. And it was during this time, if you think about this time, it was a time in which labor unions got their okay from Teddy Roosevelt, which was amazing, a great thing. And it was a time when we got suddenly the car, the plane, the radio, the telephone. You know, it was like all of these things that drastically changed the world and changed the way people would live. But if it's just like with the digital revolution now. If you're of a certain age, you know, you're more connected to the way things were before, and your resentment, you have resentment of the changes that are happening too fast. And they're allowing young people to have more freedom than you're able to deal with or control. And so there was a big reaction against it. So during the first 2 decades of the 20th century, you have progressivism right up to World War I. And World War I very much changed all that. And one of the things that changed is in the wake of World War I, there were many refugees.
I was going to say, after war, people are depressed after war. There's been tragedy after war. They're looking to fill the void.
It was a horrible
They've
war.
lost their husbands. They've lost their children. They've lost their whole families. Are looking for something, a higher power. They're looking for answers that they can't get on this physical plane.
And in the war, in World War I, there was weaponry that nobody had ever heard of before. You know,
yes.
So that makes people resent science.
It was very science fiction, is what I was going to say. Like things that they never would have thought ever could have happened, that would ever be invented or created, that to them seemed like it came from like another planet, I'm sure.
Yes.
You know, it's like, and it seems so. We can't even control it anymore.
And a lot of the resentment of science, which is still part of it today, that begins there.
Yeah.
That wasn't there before then. And
Interesting.
And the other things that changed culture, the popularity of the movies, the car. You know, a couple of teenagers could go out in the car into the country and do
whatever they wanted.
Who knows what? You know, so there was a sense that sin is coming in. You know, and that
music as well.
Music, jazz music.
Yeah.
All of these things.
Dancing.
And broadcasting, you have somebody outside of your control coming into your home and telling your kids things on the radio. You know, it's all of these changes happened. The other thing was that there was a big influx of immigrants from Italy and Ireland. And these are Catholic places. And before this time, there was absolutely no face of Catholicism in American religion. So it was a new thing.
It was more from England and all of that, those types of religions.
Right,
yes?
the Protestant religions.
Yes.
And, Anglicanism in the form of Episcopalianism.
Right.
And there were also, in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, there was this huge bloom of theosophy, mental science, all of this
That's what
stuff.
I was thinking. There's a huge occult movement.
Well, and also
Yeah.
like the slaves brought their religion over as well. You know, when we brought from Africa, so there was that as well, which was a certain form of Christianity.
Well, I don't know about that.
It became later a certain form of a type of
It
Christianity.
affected Christianity.
Yes.
Very much.
Yes.
Yes.
But we had that religion here as well. It wasn't being practiced mainstream because unfortunately it took us a long time to integrate. You know, we freed the slaves, but they were still slaves in the eyes of many people. They were unfortunately, the African Americans were still considered inferior for a long time. So their religion, I'm sure, wasn't even acknowledged either.
No.
You know, that was an evil kind of like, you know, thing.
No,
I would imagine
they did everything they could to beat that religion.
Yes. Yeah.
But so there was all of these things happening. The immigrants with their Catholicism, it's very difficult to understand today how threatening that was to people. The sense that they would be responding to this pope who would tell them what to do and they would overthrow the country and kill us all. It's just complete illogic. So in 1915, there was a 12-volume set called The Fundamentals that was about 90 articles by a lot of different writers, mostly pastors.
Now, this was Protestant, right?
Yes.
Coming from the Protestant.
Yes. It was anti-Catholic. The 12-volume set of The Fundamentals was anti-Catholic, anti-spiritualism, anti-Christian Science, anti-everything. I mean, it was anti-modernism, anti-Darwin, and you know all of this stuff. And the other thing was that when you study Scripture in theology to this day, if you go to an accredited school, which not all evangelical ministers do, they go to their own schools because they don't like the way the religion is taught. But there was this guy, Gerhard von Rad, a German theologian in the late 19th century, who kind of created the science that we use today for scriptural criticism, for understanding the Bible, understanding its sources, understanding its context, and a theology that assumed metaphor in the Bible, assumed metaphor. In other words, it opened the door to interpretation. And for some reason, the major theologians of that day, and it was during that time that theology went way forward and that stuff is still being taught, but the major theologians of the day, like Gerhard von Rad, were Germans. So there was another, because it was kind of an anti-German thing at the end of World War I that played a role in, you got to read the Bible this way, you got to read it my way, not the smart way, you know, that led to that kind of a conviction. Interestingly enough, the same year, 1915, there was a very popular movie called Birth of a Nation.
Yes.
Where
won the Oscar, the first Oscar, I think.
Yeah. It was for a long, until Gone with the Wind was made, it was considered the best movie ever made.
Right.
But it inspired a revival of the Ku Klux Klan. And there have been 3 Ku Klux Klans in our history. The first one was during the period after the Civil War, where they dressed up in sheets and they, you know, menaced the freed slaves so that they wouldn't vote, whatever,
right.
and hung them and lynched them and all that. That was gone by the end of that century. And then in 1915, the second Ku Klux Klan was founded in the wake of the interest in the movie, Birth of a Nation. And it just went crazy. There was Klan chic. I mean, people in New York society parties had Klan parties, you know, where everybody would dress up in a sheet. And it was a huge success.
Horrible.
Wow, that is really horrible.
And it built its following around anti-Catholicism. It was the fear of the Catholics. And it was the guy that wrote the charter that started it, and it was like a fraternal organization, like the Masons, the Elks, you know, and it was something that everybody did. Like when you see that Harry Truman was in the Ku Klux Klan or that Ralph Byrd was in the Ku Klux Klan.
Everybody was in it.
They were just trying to make it in their city. You know,
Right.
you joined the Rotary, you joined it. It was
Right.
like that. In 1925, the rolls were 6 million. They had 6 million members.
Wow.
It was huge. And what they did that really made them popular was they had this PR, this man and a woman who were wild alcoholics, and they were public relations advertising people. And they came up with this concept. You get the churches. You go to the churches. So what they started to do, they would visit a Methodist church or I'm a disciple. They really made inroads into the disciples. They'd visit the church. They'd flatter the minister. They'd bring in all these members. And then they would get the minister all these lucrative speaking engagements that he'd be gone a long time, and they would take over the church.
Oh, wow.
And this happened all over the place, and it was growing and growing and growing. And then in 1926, it was stopped dead when the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan, a guy named Stevenson, in Indianapolis, which was the center of the Klan, also it was the center of my church, the Disciples Church, he kidnapped a female social worker, held her in a train car for 2 days, and just physically mutilated her for 2 days. And she lived long enough. She escaped finally after 2 days. She made it to the hospital. She told her story, and then she died of her wounds.
Oh, my God.
Oh, my
And
God.
the trial of this guy was on the radio every day. It was the beginning of broadcasting. It was like the OJ trial. It was it was the thing that got people in the habit of listening to the radio. And they're listening to this every day about all the awful things he did to this woman. And it was the end. It was the end. I mean, the Ku Klux Klan went on to exist until they finally ended it in the late 40s.
Why did he do that? Was he just crazy, or was it some other motive?
Well, I think he was a very mean guy. I mean, I
because
think,
he wanted to control.
Yeah. I imagine there was a bit of alcohol involved, but this is what I'm talking about. This guy was a big church man. He was a big fundamentalist, you know, and he was probably had a lot to say about the way other people should act.
Look at how he's acting.
But that's
that isn't part of fundamentalism supposed to be following the 10 Commandments?
Thou shalt not kill.
Well, how about that? You know,
I mean,
right.
How about that?
Yeah.
I mean,
you're not even remotely.
that's why I say
in
that
case.
definition that is in the dictionary is unearned. You know, that's not, and I got to repeat, I'm not talking about rank and file people who believe in something and they live good lives, and I'm not criticizing that. I'm talking about the leadership and the people that raise and pocket all the money.
Right.
Anyway.
He may not have liked that she was this woman who was a social worker and she had a degree and was a social worker and earned her own money and didn't have necessarily a husband at that point.
I don't think I'm not sure about that.
But it's like that. It could have been something like that, like how you're gonna atone for the sins of all the people, all the women that are not at home, staying in their place. I mean, it could have been something. He could have made a pass at her, and she might have just turned him down and was like, no. Interesting.
One of the things I got the impression about fundamentalism is it seems very much like the white men and very racist and misogynist if you think about it. I mean, it seems like it's in it already somehow. I mean, the way it's happening, like it seems, or at least a version of the colonial conquering. There seems to be, and since the Ku Klux Klan were so involved, it makes sense that there's a racial element underneath it to begin with, like. And then this misogynist kind of energy as well.
The misogyny is what really exists today. The the fundamentalists of that time, you know, they were, there was the Scopes trial, and that was in 1925, the same year as this other stuff I'm talking about. And that, again, was something people listened to on the radio every day, which is kind of mischaracterized by Inherit the Wind. You've seen the movie, they do a fictional version of that, and it's not quite the way it was. But there was a law in Tennessee that you could not teach Darwin. And there were people who wanted to test
Inherit
the
the
law.
wind.
That's what I'm talking about.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There were people who wanted to test the law.
Yeah.
And because it had never been used. And the guy, unlike in the movie where the guy gets up in the classroom and they come for him and they drag him off to jail.
Right.
The guy, Scopes, was a willing participant in this. It was really kind of a put-up thing where they wanted to prove that either the law was unconstitutional or that it had teeth. One or the other. Let's find out which it is. So he was like a substitute teacher who was willing to say he had taught Darwin, although later he admitted, I'm not sure I did. But
Right.
it was a big show trial. There was money from the people that published the fundamentals. There was money for William Jennings Bryan to be the prosecutor. And he was probably the most famous fundamentalist of his day because he'd also been in politics. And the Mencken and the Baltimore newspaper paid for Clarence Darrow to come out and represent Scopes. And it was, it was kind of a battle royale about, whether or not a religious person can believe in science. That was on the radio every day. And the judge was very much on the side of the prosecution and didn't really allow the jury. He instructed the jury to vote guilty. It was one of the most unfair trials there's ever been. But this rages on. This idea, and that was the target of the fundamentals, the book. Their main target was Darwin. And because they made the argument that Darwin's studies go against what it says in the Bible about how the world was created.
Right, as opposed to understand the Bible is a beautiful book.
It's poetry.
Yes.
It's poetry. It's like this 6th day, before you invent the sun and the moon, what's a day? It's like, it's all so poetic and beautiful. But the idea that faith, and to me, the teachings of Jesus Christ are hard to understand, and what Jesus wanted us to do was grapple with them, think about them, get into the river and feel the current and really think about it. But fundamentalism says that religion is a simple matter of simply, I believe everything that's here exactly the way they're telling me.
And the pastor is a direct line from God. So therefore, or what do they call them in fundamental? Like the pastor, yes, is the direct line from God. And so therefore you have to believe everything he says.
Well, that's where it gets kind of tricky. And because that's the way non-Catholics view Catholicism. That, that the Pope says it, you got to believe it.
And as a Catholic myself, I don't believe everything the Pope says. Most Catholics, even Catholics that are practicing, that go to church every Sunday, they're not there are people that do believe everything the Pope says, but there's a lot of Catholics that really don't.
Well, Mary Daly.
So,
it's a very rich tradition.
Yes.
And the people in Catholicism, Roman Catholicism anyway, are very European about it.
Yeah.
It's like, it's no big deal. You do the thing, it's fine.
Yeah, you go to church on Sunday, you take what, as my mother says, I just take what I like and I don't listen to any of the rest. That's what she says. And there's a lot of people, a lot of Catholics like that, where it's like they go, they enjoy the ritual, they grew up that way, it means something to them. The priest gives the sermon. If they don't like it, my mother, I'm like, well, I used to, when I was a teenager, I said, well, what's the point of going if you don't agree, if you don't like what he says? And she's just like, well, you that's not what it's about. You just take what to me, it was appalling, the idea.
Well, it's about the sacraments.
Yes.
For Catholics. It's like you go to communion.
That's the great way of saying it. They enjoy the ritual, they enjoy the sacrament, they enjoy that part of it. It means something to them. And if the priest says a few things that they don't agree with.
Yeah, but you're kind of making light of some really powerful things the Pope does do, like control birth control, and finally.
Actually, I'm not.
No.
I'm just talking about lighter things.
Let me finish. Like, the Pope has a huge impact on women.
Of course.
Just because I go home and say I don't agree with the Pope, I may go along, however, and not really rebel and say, hey, I really want to see birth control. I really, so I think that yes and no, people may not agree with the Pope, but they also don't openly disagree, with all these leaders. They have huge impact on our psyche,
Of course.
all of the ritual and the pomp and circumstance. So, and think of the Crusades and Inquisition, and, there's a lot of harm that's come through on the Catholic side as well. And I think it goes down to your earlier observation that there's two kinds of religions within all religions. There's this stuff where people just want to buy it and not think for themselves. And they're going to go along with things, even if at home they say, I don't really believe it. And then there are people
then you might say
really,
that my mother is agreeing to disagree.
No,
oh, well, I don't agree with him.
I'm not saying that your mother is anything.
No, but it's like, well, I don't like for what's happening with all the priests that are sexually abusing people. I would say a lot of Catholics are completely in disagreement of that. And a lot of people do speak up about those things, and some people don't. So I mean, it's interesting.
But again, it gets back to not the rank and file,
right?
But the power structure,
right?
Yeah.
That's where those secrets are kept.
Right.
I think the rank and file Catholics would rather that
well,
wasn't
and it's like
happening.
the priest.
It's
like the Pope right now that won't leave the Vatican because if he leaves, he will get arrested. Right? It was like the last Pope. He doesn't leave the Vatican. He won't ever leave Vatican City. You know what I mean? So they're actually protecting him. They're not throwing him out of Vatican City and saying you need to pay for what you've done. They're sitting in there protecting, and there are a lot of secrets absolutely within that power structure.
Yeah.
That are
but it's
evil.
like I said on a different episode of this. All I got to do is let the women in. Let the women be priests. Let the women be priests. They'll clean it up. I'm telling you, it's their inability to do that. Right. To me, people talk about, well, they're thinking about maybe letting priests. We talked about this. Maybe letting priests marry. It's like, who cares? Let them not marry. That's okay. But let women be priests. That's where they have kept themselves in the dark ages.
Yeah.
Right.
But I want to say, because you mentioned the abortion question, which of course right now it's setting the world on fire.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, it's
absolutely.
It's a big deal.
Yes.
And in my view, the evangelicals are worse there than the Catholics, in my view, and I'll say why. The Catholics go back to the question, the Pope who did, who put words to it. It goes back to the question of, is the fetus a human being? And so that's the question that they start with, that they're answering yes, that life starts at conception. Actually, if you want to be scriptural about it, I guess you're thinking that that's in the Bible, right? Life starts at conception? No. Life starts with breath in the Bible. Every time. Every time. You're not alive. You're not a person until you breathe. So I'm not saying that's a justification or not. I'm just saying if you want to be scriptural about it, let's really be scriptural about it. So anyway, that's their rationale. The rationale of the evangelicals is simply to oppress women. It doesn't have anything to do with whether or not the fetus is a human being. It's simply to oppress women. And that is an agenda with them that is just so clear in every issue that comes up, especially today. To get back a little bit to the history of it, the fundamentalism as a force, it kind of dies out in the 50s as the major evangelist of the 50s was Billy Graham. He was the guy that really brought the people out. Billy Graham, with all you might think against him, was a pluralist at heart. He was a Southerner, and he would have these big events, and thousands and thousands of people would come out. In the South, they would be segregated, and there would be a rope, and Billy Graham would walk out into the crowd. He'd pull that rope up, and he would refuse to speak any place that was going to be segregated in the 50s. He got to know and befriended Martin Luther King. He was at heart a pluralist. He was worried about Kennedy. He was very close to Eisenhower. He was worried about Kennedy because he was Catholic, but he came to believe, as he got to know Catholics, that he in meeting Kennedy, he experienced a hope for some kind of reunification. Now, that's not a fundamentalist.
Right.
You know, there's other things I could say about Billy Graham that would not be so nice, but that's kind of where fundamentalism was in the 50s, to where you could be a Democrat or a Republican and be a fundamentalist. It wasn't all part of one political party.
Right,
you know what I'm saying?
right.
It was just how people believed. The 1950s was the biggest expansion of church life in America. It grew and grew and grew and grew, and in the 50s, it grew the biggest. And when Los Angeles was being put together in the 50s, which is when there was this big migration out there,
Right.
the city planners or whatever, they assumed this growth would continue. What they did not know was this was the peak. This moment was the peak in Christianity. It would be downhill from then on.
Right.
And certainly as far as church going, and certainly as far as Los Angeles was concerned. So they overbuilt on churches to such a huge extent that you have all of these churches that have become something else.
Right.
You see this everywhere, including mine. My church became a parking lot. You know, these things happen because there's just too many of them in terms of how many people want to go to church.
Right.
But in the 50s, and I heard a guy speak once at a regional assembly. I've never forgotten this, but he got up and he was a gay guy, and he was saying, I really feel more at home in the church today because people aren't so, I don't have to pretend I'm not who I am. But he said, I remember the 50s, and the pews were full, which nobody's pews are today, other than evangelicals. Their pews are full. And AME, their pews are full. But in terms of mainline Protestant churches, no, nobody's is. And it's because we lost a lot of people. In the 50s, mainline Protestantism made a decision to go with things like Martin Luther King, the anti-war movement. You know, they made a decision in the seminaries and in the upper echelons
Right.
to go with this. We could fight it or we could go with this. Let's go with it. And they went with it. So there was a liberalizing of American Protestantism that occurred in the 50s. And a lot of people left it for that reason. And that has continued. Because the guy said, this guy was talking about, he said, I remember the pews were full because everybody believed that if they weren't there, they'd be going to hell.
Right.
And today, people don't believe that, so
Right.
they don't come, So there was a sadness in his voice as he talked about this.
Well, because wouldn't you just want to go because it's a beautiful thing to do, to
Some
go
peop-
and have the
some
ritual,
people would, but not as many.
Of course.
That's the
Of
thing.
course.
And that's fine with me, but the
Right.
whole economical structure of the church is based on there being more,
Right.
because that's how it used to was. Anyway, in the 50s, there was a liberalizing into the 60s. And then in 1972, there was this thing in my hometown of Dallas, Texas, and I was there. It was summer after my sophomore year in college, called Explo 72. And it was this thing, Billy Graham was speaking like about 9 times and a lot of others, and it was this huge explosion. And it was, to me, this event ended up being the end of the 60s. And it was the beginning of a new revivalist movement, a new fundamentalism. Whereas in the church I grew up with, everything was about social justice and being involved in the civil rights movement, being against the war, being, helping poor people, whatever. And by the time I made it to seminary, when I went to Princeton Seminary in 1974, that's the wave I was coming in on, and that wave was over. And the other students were saying things like, I'm tired of hearing all this social justice. I think we got to get back to a little good old-fashioned evangelism. And so there was the beginning of a turn away from it. And I remember this guy, Robert Schuller. You know Schuller? The Crystal Cathedral? Well, he was a big evangelist of his day, and a big money guy. Money. And he was combining a lot of sort of Norman Vincent Peale type stuff, Og Mandino type stuff,
Right.
with fundamentalism. And he was talking about how to get rich through Jesus. You know, he was sort of this kind of thing.
Also how to control people, because when you're talking about social justice, you're talking about our right to freedom, right? Everyone's right to freedom to think as they want, to believe as they want. You can't control people if you're advocating for freedom.
No, right. It's not about controlling people. It's about freeing people from control.
Right. But you can't control, but people won't give you their money come and sit there in the pew if they feel like, oh, okay, it's all going to be fine whether I go or not.
Yeah, and they don't need to give money. What's the difference?
Right.
But so anyway, this guy Schuler, he gets up and all he's talking about is in the chapel. He gets up and everybody wants to hear about his theological views. All he's talking about is how much money you can make. And what was then beginning was televangelism. And man, that thing just blew up. It mushroomed. It was like the whole fundamentalist movement, which had been dead.
I still don't understand it.
It blew up. The 700 Club. It just.
I grew up with that, and I was a kid. I didn't know what it was. I used to kind of watch it a little bit because they used to have these stories about helping people, and the mother was dying, and they went in and they helped, and then all of a sudden they're coming on and asking for money. I'm like, what is that?
It's still really popular. And what is it about people that they give their money away so easily, and they don't even have much to give? How do they still?
And what is it about television?
Well, because
the fact that this guy's asking for money on television.
Have a lot of money.
I can pick up the phone, dial the 800 number, and just give the money, man. And the guy on television told me to. So I'm connecting to that guy. You know, it's like
who's rich and who has everything they want, and they're telling these stories about all these people that didn't have and now they have. And well, if I get involved and I give them a little bit of my money, then maybe God will bless me, or this man will pray for me. As I used to say, we're going to pray for you all.
I'll tell you guys a funny story about the money-making aspect. I was watching this show. Remember, there's the chick with the really big hair and her husband.
Tammy Baker?
And they had, some other chick. And they had...
I'm going to get to Tammy Baker.
They had Benny Hinn on, the little faith healer guy in the white suit with all the jewelry. And they did a documentary on him on one of the networks, ABC or CBS or whatever it was. And they actually kind of exposed him. They went through all the faith healing stuff, and they proved kind of that he was a fraud more than anything. So they had him on the show, and they're going on about, it was like Trinity Broadcasting or something. And so they're going on about how horrible this was, and poor Benny, and that this was all, a setup job. But you know what? What we really need to do is produce our own documentary for Benny to help him. So please send us your money. They actually turned it into a moneymaker, just like that. They understood exactly how to turn that to their advantage. I thought that was really cool.
And they had amazing success. And that whole industry, televangelism, it was so cheap to do.
Yeah.
It's like you don't have to build a church, maintain a church. You just point a camera at somebody.
Very low production. And it was on during the day around the soap operas.
Yeah.
So it was a lot of women that were home, that were working, or people that didn't have jobs. And, you're sitting around, and then some person is like, well, if you, kind of go this way, give us a little bit of money, we'll pray for you, and everything will be great.
So there was that, but still that was not political. That was what it was, but it was not political. And in my opinion, it was this guy, Ralph Reed. You know Ralph Reed? Do you
No.
get a picture in your mind of Ralph Reed?
Yes.
He was a young, good-looking guy who came. He didn't come from religion. He came from young Republicans. He came from political land.
Right.
And he was an active Republican, and then he had a much ballyhooed religious conversion, or he found Jesus. He was born again. He was born again. And 1983.
I was going to say the Reagan era is when the fundamentalists and the Republicans sort of became...
He's the guy, Ralph Reed is the guy, because he had all of this expertise in business, from marketing and all this stuff. He's the guy that by the late 80s, by 88,
right,
he had sewn these guys into the Republican Party.
Yeah.
I mean, he did it, and he had a style. He's still around. I mean, he was on Bill Maher not too long ago. He's unlike a lot of evangelists. He's not loud, pushy. He's got a lot of Cary Grant in him. I mean, he's very suave, and he's very well spoken, and he's soft-spoken, but effectively soft-spoken. But he's the guy who sewed in. You know, there was a day when there were Republicans who were pro-choice. I mean, in my lifetime, you know, it's like, when you think about I think it was the 2012 election when they had the Republican debates, and all of the and there was a whole, it was early, there was a whole ton of candidates all in a line up there. And the first question was, does anybody believe Darwin? And nobody raised their hands. Not one of them.
Wow.
Not one of them. Wow. And I want to say this about Darwin. The work he did was foundational to the lives that we lead today.
Yes.
The current science, say, of DNA, where we're able to solve a crime that happened 20 years ago, whatever, the science of DNA, we would not have if it were not for the work of Darwin.
Do you know he was going to become a priest? And he went on the voyage on kind of a last-minute decision, and he only had experience collecting things. He had no scientific background.
Wow.
Yeah, it's in the book by Robert Greene Mastery, the story of Darwin, how he got to be. Then when he came back, he had to do all this really meticulous, boring scientific stuff, like 8 years of it. But he, as a kid, would just go, he was really interested in collecting things. He had this passion, so he followed his passion. And he ends up getting on this voyage just by chance in a way. So it was all like very kind of synchronized.
There was
but he was going to be like
a
priest, I think, that because he didn't know what he was going to do. And if it wasn't for that voyage, then who knows what would have happened. And so he's kind of a fascinating character to begin with. You know, how he got to be what he was, you know, and had to, like I said, go back and learn all the science to be able to support all of his theories and everything. And he was very young.
Well, I believe he grew up in the Church of England. And he did eventually break with them and became, I think, a Unitarian. But the work he did was no joke. I mean, and has been mischaracterized, I should say, in terms of its value to us today. But they still talk about it, and they still get upset if you're teaching it, you know, and it's beyond me. I mean, I got into I have friends who are evangelicals, and I get into a conversation about whether or not there were dinosaurs. And at one point she says, well, maybe, she said, there's one sentence in there. Maybe that's when they were. You know, it's like, this book isn't going to tell you much about the dinosaurs. Right. I'm sorry. It's like, it's not.
And it's interesting because what do they think is in museums? They think everyone's just making it. It's a propaganda. It's a big sort of like, you know, to convince us and control us or some sort of.
Yeah.
Where do all these?
It's like Holocaust deniers.
From? Yes.
How do you maintain that worldview? I don't know, but many people do, and so. What we have today is, you know, it's like with what Ralph Reed did, in my opinion, he just really sandwiched fundamentalism in with the Republican Party so that they would have to have certain things in their platform, no matter who was, or you couldn't run. And they sold this. They sold this through the televangelists, through all these other means of selling. They sold this so effectively. And then we have the presidency. You know, that Carter was a religious man, but we just didn't get these problems from him. Clinton was religious, but his religion was more AME, which is a completely different world. And then we get Bush, who came up in that world. His life was changed. He got off the booze by going to these evangelical Bible study classes, and that's how he was able to start again. And when his dad ran in 92, I think it was.
Well, he was a moderate Republican originally. And it's interesting because he didn't win again the second time around. And I, just from my own history and history, the research I did on it, because he was
he didn't win again.
The first George Bush.
You're talking about Herbert Walker Bush. Okay.
Yes, the first George Bush was a moderate Republican to begin with. He was not like that he was not like a Reagan Republican.
Well, he was also not particularly religious.
No, I mean, the second George Bush W was, and he did get him off the booze. He was much more fundamental. But it was interesting to me that he didn't win the second time around, and I don't think he was fundamentalist enough for the Republican Party, because that's right around that era where they were really, as you said, sewing in Republican equals
Christian.
Yes. And fundamentalist. Yeah. And Sarah Palin with I don't believe in evolution.
Yeah.
Don't you think too that the second Bush helped to cause the rise of the Islamic, I don't want to use fundamentalism, I know it's different. I was reading about fundamentalism in different religions is different than the Christian fundamentalism, but there was the religious battle really started becoming open in terms of the Muslim world and the Christian world, I think, because of Bush.
What?
Because you set a tone. You set like Trump sets a tone. You give permission for these things that are cooking to rise up and to basically come out in the open. Because it seems like that's at least when a lot more attention was being drawn around those two different religions.
I think Bush W went a lot farther than anybody's going today.
Yeah.
In saying Muslims are human beings. Don't blame them for this. I mean, he did come out and say that. You wouldn't see Trump do that. You would not see that today. But the thing about him is that he came up in that world, and when his daddy was running in 92,
yes,
he was kind of a family black sheep, and he came into the fold as a guy who could maybe connect his daddy with the religious right, because his daddy didn't get that. And he got involved, and he said to the people running the campaign, he said, I could bring these people in a big way in a national campaign. And, sort of that started the idea. And his solid core, that couldn't be chipped away. It was, I think Trump's got 40%. I think he had about 30% of solid core. And he spoke a language. He used words that community understand. They're kind of underground words.
Yeah.
So he put a big lock on them. What the lock is on them with Trump, I have no explanation for it. I have no explanation for it.
You'd think that the evangelical people would actually not like Trump. In many ways. I mean, they do. But if you think of like Trump from the 90s on Sex and the City, when he was just like, the Donald, and like he was more of a glamorous kind of playboy type back then, like a New York chic, rich New Yorker, you'd think that those people would never identify with this sort of like rich, came from money, went to these big schools, real estate mogul, lives in Trump Tower, dates all these glamorous women, cheats on his wife, has 3 wives. You know what I mean?
Plus, there's nothing about him that's funny, entertaining,
right,
amusing. I don't get it. But to get back to something you were talking about, the Islamic revival in fundamentalism.
Mm-hmm.
I had a friend who is no longer with us, who was a real expert in Islamics. And I always went to him whenever anything happened. We understand so little about that religion in our culture.
Yeah.
We do not get it. And it's the fact that we don't get it that I think caused that riff much earlier than W. Bush. But what this guy said is basically in the Islamic world, there is a Shiite revival, which is a fundamentalist revival, every 300 years. And this one kind of was coming right on target. It also happened in the wake of the Soviets bombing the bejesus out of Afghanistan. That's something that isn't mentioned enough as something that determined the kind of world we live in today.
Interesting.
Because people talk about it like the Soviets lost that war. Well, nobody won it, but Afghanistan was just obliterated and became a feeding ground for refugees. And this whole bad treatment of the women and the Taliban coming in and all this kind of stuff happened in the wake of that.
Interesting.
And-
well, we are coming to the end
Ooh,
of
I
our
hear the
show.
music.
The music is on, and
Love it.
we really enjoyed having you. It was a really hot
you.
topic, and I hope you all enjoyed it. Please like us, subscribe to our channel, watch some of Jim McGrath's previous shows. They're all really fantastic. And thank you again for coming on the show.
Thank you so much. It's
really
great.
Enjoyed
I
it.
love the show. You guys do a great show.
And thank you all. Have a great week. And join us next week as we continue to explore the esoteric and obscure.